Things are all good here. We're already recording.
Wonderful.
I wanted to suggest that there was some discussion in terms of programming, where things are headed. And one of the threads of discussion would be for events and in-person meetings, transportation issues in New York City or thereabout. So I think a membership meeting, a chapter meeting might be in order to address that.
Absolutely. We have Revels coming up, so we'll meet each other at least, and we can certainly arrange in-person meetings next week. I think Hal's already got six dates for our readings. Happy to extend them. We have the room, so we can do what we like. And I know we have at least a couple planned for New Jersey. We also have the idea of local groups for Albany, Pennsylvania, a couple of other spaces where there feels like there's a little cluster of authors who may be interested in connecting. All good ideas for next year.
Well, we do have a group of 4 or 5 of us who get together in Buffalo, not to meet regularly, but we do programming together during May, which is Mystery Month. And I was at an award ceremony the other night and ran into a TV anchor who I know, who grew up with my younger sister. And I talked to her about the possibility of doing some television programming on a talk show, a local talk show she does for Mystery Month in May. And she seemed amenable to the idea. So, I think people can do that. And if there are groups that are, places like Albany, or, I mean, the major cities in New York, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, New York City. If there are groups that are close by, like if a group in Syracuse wanted to have a meeting, I could go to a group in Syracuse and take part in a meeting, or do a presentation or whatever. And that might be fun to do.
Absolutely. So I'm saying hello to a bunch of familiar faces. Hello, David. I see George. Hello, hello. I know we have Beth. Marjorie's there again. Thank you guys. Thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see you. I really don't have other things to open this talk with other than we have Revels coming up on December 2nd, is it? We have that already up. It is a Monday. We have it scheduled already. It's on the calendar. The Eventbrite is already up. And the seats are limited. We have a max on the room. So if you're planning to come, and this time we can accommodate +1s. So bring your sweetheart. And it should be a lovely party. It's right in Times Square. It's very close to a subway, well commutable, very easy to get to. It's called M Social is the name of the hotel. We're on the 7th floor and it's a lovely location. So that's really my only announcement. December is right around the corner. So, get in there. I know it will be cool, but that's December for you. And it's been a wonderful year. We have had so much activity this year. So thank you all for participating, for being here, for writing, yes, thank you. I see all the balloons going up. How did you do that, Pamela? Oh, you do that? Okay, very cool. Isn't Zoom amazing? So I'm going to hand over to Gary. He has a wonderful program lined up for you. We have great speakers today. I'm excited for this one. So go ahead, Gary.
Okay, Nev, one final thing. Would you have Hal reach out to me with the dates he has for library readings?
Absolutely.
We have friends we stay with in Brooklyn when we get to the city, and I would very much like to come down and take part in a reading.
That would be great.
We'd have to look for the dates and see.
Yes.
Okay, I can't pull up our speakers' bios and keep my Zoom screen and the chat screen. I don't have that big a monitor, and my eyes are not that good for squinting. So, Elizabeth Mannion and Brian Cliff, and your faces keep moving around. Oh, here you are. Someone else coming in. And admit. are both critics. I just read their most recent collection of book reviews, but they're both critics, and that's something that as writers we have to pay attention to. We have to think about how our work is being received. So Beth is part of our chapter and Brian is not. So I'll let them talk about themselves a bit, and then we can go from there. So the critic speaker.
Okay, hi everybody. Brian and I first met, we both taught at Trinity College in Dublin, but not at the same time, or at least our paths never crossed there. So it was when I was working on my first book on Irish crime fiction for Palgrave Macmillan that I was put into touch with Brian, because he was instrumental in a very important conference that was held at Trinity back in, I want to say 2003, but Brian will correct me if I have that wrong, on crime fiction. 2013, thanks. It was a crime fiction symposium. I'll let him tell you about it. So I was put in touch with him, and he wrote a chapter on, was it John Connolly?
Yeah.
In that book. And the book launch was at NYU's Glucksman Ireland House with Stuart Neville and John Connolly and a few other writers present. And it was the first time we got to meet in person. And we decided then and there that a more robust book was needed to pay attention to Irish crime writing. And that led to Guilt Rules All, which was the book that we worked on together. And then that led to our being asked by our editor at the Irish Times to take over a bi-monthly column reviewing Irish crime fiction when the person who had been handling every other month stepped back. So we alternate our column every other month with Declan Burke, a very big name in Irish crime writing, both as an author and as a critic, and our colleague at the Times. And we've been doing it since August of last year, so about a year and a half. And we review 5 books each time it's our turn. And so we're somewhat limited in space, and it's an interesting process to me, because there's probably roughly about 100 titles that are published each month, and we whittle it down to a short list of about 35 titles that we then sift through to decide on the 5 that are going to go in. We don't do negative reviews, so it's just about getting the 5 that we feel the most strongly about into the column.
That's being a little modest. One thing I'd add to that genealogy, I think, is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Beth was making a funny face. Our editor at the Times actually asked Beth to take over for the previous columnist, Declan Hughes, who's also, I think, a great Irish crime writer. Though he hasn't published anything, unfortunately, in about 10 years. Yeah. And she asked me if I'd want to collaborate on it, which was generous of her. So I would just add that minor correction, I guess. And yeah, essentially what she said, I'd been teaching at contemporary Irish writing at Trinity College for a number. I mean, I was there about 9 years overall, but for a number of years, and started to realize that I was in my free time reading a lot of Irish crime fiction. This would have been around 2009, and that maybe I should find a way to make it look like that was my job. And one of the things I came up with was the Festival of Irish Crime Fiction that Beth mentioned, which actually put together with Professor John Waters from Glucksman House at NYU. And it was very deliberately, there were none of us speaking at it, no academics. It was all, I think it was 17 Irish novelists, plus Michael Connolly on sort of a free Irish American pass. And it was, it was fantastic. We cobbled together just enough funding to make it free, except for John Connolly interviewing Michael Connolly, which was, like €5. And it was fantastic attendance. And there were hundreds of people who, I don't know if any of you've been to Dublin, but it's Trinity, I think, is maybe a little bit like somewhere like Yale, like it's a walled island in the middle of the city, and you will still meet lifelong Dubliners of significant age who have always walked around it, and it's kind of blocking a straight north-south route. So people have to come south, kind of dip around the front end of the college walls, and then carry on their way. And so it was really meaningful to be able to put together this event where, certainly I think there were maybe 600 discrete guests, probably 400 or 500 of whom had never been on campus before, despite living in Dublin. And that was a really meaningful experience. Then out of that, I started writing my own book about Irish crime fiction. And I think when I was working on that, Beth and I met, and our collaboration just kind of continued from there.
Okay. I know you read other crime fiction as well, and what do you see as critics? What are publishing trends that we should probably be aware of at this point?
We started to see trends, I'd say about 6 months in, to doing the column. And the biggest one, the most obvious one to me, was the reunion weekend, usually at a 30th birthday or a 40th birthday. And they were just every month, 2 or 3 of them. And that has not stopped in the year and a half since we've started. And that is, I understand the impulse to use it, especially for a locked room mystery, although they tend to become locked island mysteries because you're Airbnb-ing some fancy house on an island or something like this. The shape it takes of the setting has evolved as very quickly in the year and a half. So that's a big one. And it's one that's hard to do well, without falling into cliches. More recently, dead authors, which some of you might be interested in knowing, has become a bit of a trend. Correlates obviously did it with The Plot, which was the first in the current series she's working on, although I think there's just going to be one more book. And the sequel, which we reviewed, if it wasn't November, it was 2 months ago, I can't remember now, is probably the best example of how to do that well that I've ever come across, where an author who's deceased is central to the plot. But the mystery is, sometimes it's in who killed the author. But in the Correlates case, it was using the dead author, who's the spouse of the central character in the sequel, kind of almost making him irrelevant, but he becomes important in giving the psychological insight into the protagonist of the novel. Historical crime fiction remains a dominant trend, mostly World War II. That's the one I see the most, although we just came across one that we're looking at for January that deals with Edgar Allan Poe. And I don't remember ever seeing anything before that deals with a historical figure that is part of the crime writing community. So I'm very curious about that one. And speculative crime fiction is on the rise, certainly.
One thing I'd add about the historical is, I think that's right. It's a lot of World War II and World War II adjacent material. There is, though, there's a lot of kind of Edwardian and late Victorian stuff, but that tends, this is a very broad generalization, to lean a little bit more into maybe not the cozy, but the kind of deliberately, consciously archaic. And kind of those are more likely to be homage to kind of a golden age in some sense approach. And the World War II material the writing itself might feel very contemporary in a lot of ways, where anything kind of before that seems to be a little less likely to feel that way. there's something else I want to say about the speculative and one or two other things, but just a note for Richie, who seems to be noticing a lot of background things. I have two monitors, and the displays are built into one, so they're both off center on the desk because the keyhole's in the middle. So I'm stuck with this. But there is a lot of speculative, and I think that is something that we try to make room for, kind of Catholic with a small c, understanding of the genre and its boundaries. And for me, that's probably because one of the people I came to Irish crime fiction through was John Connolly, who of course is heavily engaged with supernatural elements in his Charlie Parker series. And Stuart, I'm teaching a class at 1 a.m. West Coast time tonight for a friend back in Dublin on Stuart Neville's novel, The 12, which again is essentially a ghost story. And I think that's been something that's been important to both of us, is to play around with that a little bit. And I would second what Beth was saying about, reunion weekends, birthday weekends, bachelorette party weekends. Not so many bachelor weekends, more bachelorette weekends, islands, sailing trips. And I also this is the 2022, the books were arriving in 2022. I was a judge for best novel for the Edgars. So, 400 and some odd hardcovers kind of crossed the threshold that year. And it was an object lesson in some of the trends. And so what Beth was talking about was apparent there. And it's I don't know, to get back to Gary's question about things to kind of watch out for in terms of trends and patterns, it's kind of by the time it gets to us, it was sort of enough of a trend maybe 3 years ago when someone conceived of the book. And so it's kind of like steering a big boat. Like there's a lot of momentum, and by the time you have to kind of stop long before you actually get to where you want to be, I think, as far as some of that goes. And especially, when I think I can say this without violating the ADA, like judging the Edgars, something that was interesting and fun in a January release was maybe less appealing in a November or December release. When not because it was worse, just it becomes harder to stand out from the crowd. The wider that pattern is, or the wider its footprint is, I think. Okay. And if I can also, there was another question again from Richie, why we don't do negative reviews. I think I'll say my piece is, we only have 1,200 words 6 times a year. And I would rather spend those insofar as possible on books that there's something I'm excited to say about.
And I would add to that there is so much good work out there that we're sirens on Broadway, that we're really focused on championing the best of the best, rather than devoting any time to, giving a negative review to something that we recognize required a whole lot of work and so much effort goes into writing it. I'm not inclined to knock somebody down when they've put that kind of effort into things. I would rather champion, what can be championed.
And it's not lack of discrimination. I mean, I'm a judgmental bitch in private. I just don't want to commit that to print at someone else's expense.
That's limited.
I would have to have a really. I take Richie's point about cover what's not working, but I'd have to have a really good reason to do that. And maybe it's Catholic thinking that the sin of omission matters as much as the sin of commission. Leaving the things out says a little bit on its own, I think.
Yeah. David has a question in the chat. Should one seek to stand out from the crowd? What's better, to do what has often been done, but never so well, or something new? I don't know how to answer that. That strikes me as something that happens at the editor level in a publishing house. And I imagine they're very focused on, what's going to sell, and so they have a different take on trends than we do, but they certainly would notice them the same. We come across plenty of novels that fit into a similar category. And let's say we have 5 historical fiction novels in a given month on our short list, which isn't unusual. We will look at those 5 almost, I look at them kind of in a cluster when I can, when it's a subgenre. And I will look for the one that stands out. And what makes it stand out to me generally is not so much did they find one little niche within the event of World War II. It's always the character for me. And if they wrote a character who brings depth and nuance to those events that I haven't seen before, that's more likely to stand out than a little nugget of the events that happened during World War II that maybe hasn't been written about in a mystery before. I will look to character frequently for something that stands out.
Okay. Well,
Yeah. Sorry, Gary.
Oh no, I was going to say that that makes sense in terms of characters driving stories anyway. But sometimes, when you're writing, you have an obligation to sort of check and see if what you're doing will be like too many other things, or if it's something new. You should be versed in your area. A few years ago, I was blocking out because I got really excited about the possibility of doing a murder mystery, in an alternate history novel, and then I realized after I did some digging that the only 2 topics that most people deal with in terms of alternate history is if the Nazis won the war or the Confederates won the war, and what the world would be like because of that. And those have been done so much that I thought, if I do that kind of thing, I need to find a different historical period, which I haven't yet. So I'm doing something else right now. But I think that's part of the writer's responsibility, is to figure out if the thing he has is worth pursuing, or if it's something that's different enough that he has a shot with it, rather than I'm going to do what somebody else did. Because we're an imitative species. We do that a lot anyway. You pick the time period, and you will see medical thrillers, and you see them on bookshelves, you see them on television, you'll find medical thrillers. Another time you come along, you'll find spy thrillers. Another time you come along, you'll find a romance thriller where the male is a sketchy guy, but in the long run, he proves to be a pretty decent person. Those things happen so much that I really do think we have to do digging as writers to know what other people have done. I had a guy come to me once when I was at the university, and he said, "They told me you're the guy to see if I want to write a book." I said, "Okay, first let me ask you what you read." He said, "I don't read. I don't want my work to be derivative." I said, and this is a quote, "If you won't read other writers, why the hell should anybody read you?" And you read so you know what you're doing is not derivative, because otherwise you have no idea. And I can think of a guy who did a paper once. He was a new professor. He did a paper with the presentation at a conference I was at, and the theme was literature is a journey. And at the end, I walked up to him and he said, "So what did you think? The idea that literature is a journey?" I said, literature's always been a journey. I mean, the name of the Odyssey, maybe it's always a journey. So you have to know what's done so you don't follow those trends and fall into those traps of imitating others. But okay, Brian, you were going to say something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think and this might be take a slightly different tack than you were, Gary. I mean, as a reader, as a critic, I don't worry a lot about originality as a category unto itself,
Mhm.
honestly. You know, we to expand on what Beth was saying, she talked about character. For me, it's character, but it's also um, a little bit of personality goes a goddamn long way to the prose and to the character. And you know, there's one book I picked up last year. Think I'll give it 20 pages and cross off the list because it was more about true crime podcasting, which has been a lot more kind of social media based stuff in the narrative of which has been a lot. And I did not want to read another one. I was gonna, you know, cross off the list. And 10 pages in, I was hooked. And that was only because of the voice of the prose and of the ability to give. I think this is where a lot of those reunion books fall down, where they're thinking of something like Big Little Lies that will lend itself to a limited series where maybe 6 episodes kind of bounce between 6 different protagonists, that kind of thing. But they cannot really distinguish between the voices. They never give them enough time to anchor those 6 perspectives as characters, to develop them as characters, to give them enough of a distinct voice, not to just run together, you know, in a string of 37-year-old whiteness or whatever it is. And but it was Kill Show by Daniel Swearenbecker was the book that we reviewed last year. That was a real surprise. And against my inclinations on grounds of, you know, I've seen this too much. It was all the voice that carried it. And even bouncing between, you know, like one paragraph or maybe 2 sentences from a character in the podcast transcript format, still managed to make those voices kind of stand out from each other and still managed very efficiently to kind of give them some sort of personality that came off the page. And that will go a long, long way with me. Or what the other first books we reviewed, John Brownlow's Assassin 18. You know, if you read the jacket copy, it you know, just another high concept, smartass spy who's implausibly good at killing without being killed. But again, the voice and the comedic timing on the page was fantastic. Yeah. And so a lot of it, I think, is trying, yeah, obviously we read for our preferences, but a lot of it is trying to recognize this is just really good at the thing that it's trying to do.
I would add on to a brief aside about social media. That's definitely, I don't know if I would call it a trend, but obviously there's an increase in the number of books that we come across that incorporate, you know, a text message, a blog post, whatever. But it's not unusual for me to see a crime novel where the social media is being used simply to put it in there, as opposed to it being an integral part of the plot, or kind of going back to Brian's comment about you've got to make sure if you've got multiple characters, there's multiple voices. That can fall short too. Kelly Garrett's Missing White Woman is the only one I can think of in the last, you know, short while that where it made perfect sense for that protagonist to have to bump up against things like true crime podcasts and whatnot. And you know, if you're ever looking for an example of how to incorporate it beautifully, that's the one to look at, I would say, or one of the ones to look at.
And on the speculative, just to throw out someone, I thought Bill mentioned Yiddish Policemen's, and very much along those lines. We didn't get to review it because our editor had already signed it for a standalone review last year. Francis Spooford's Cahokia Jazz. I thought it was amazing, and it wasn't a historical period people are super familiar with, but it was a detective hard-boiled jazz age setting. So the premise, if anyone hasn't read it, is essentially that I might get the disease wrong, but that a different strain of smallpox came into the States that conferred immunity instead of just kind of killing off indigenous populations. And so in the Midwest into the West, some of the kind of tribal power structures survived. And so there was kind of a semi-autonomous free state of Cahokia, I think west of Kansas City, I can't remember now. And now it's into the 20s. And so there's the rise of sort of, isolationism and kind of pre-World War II nativism in the States, all kind of colliding with this semi-autonomous free state. So it's by definition not a historical period people are familiar with, but it used a slightly familiar genre, hard-boiled pop jazz age thing to deal with a context people weren't familiar with, if that makes sense. And so it is remarkably inventive, but it also really worked as a detective story.
Okay. All right. There are some, I'm looking over at some of the comments. So let's see. Should one seek to stand out from the crowd? I think most of us probably want to stand out from the crowd. And in some sense, when we're writing, we don't want people to feel they've read it before. And, I feel disinclined to say write an island mystery because it's Agatha Christie all the way. I don't want to, I'm not here to replicate what's been done. I'm hoping that we will, as writers, try to be, I don't want to use the term original because, again, I came through that literary school where we talk about there being, depending on the course and the professor, 7 plots or 10 plots that are used for everything. But I do think we should strive for something. We have to stand out, because if we're all standing in the same line, then it becomes chance. Okay, from Richie. Hey, Gary, I often discuss alt history in my Spec Phi class. The issue with writing about alt history is that you have to write about history people know. And few people know more than the big highlights of Civil War, World War II, and the assassination.
That's the comment I kind of had my eye on when I was talking about the Cahokia Jazz as something that the piece it took that people knew wasn't the history, it was the kind of hard-boiled jazz age detective.
Yeah. And I get that. One speculative fiction novel I really loved was Harry Turtledove's Ruled Britannia, because it dealt with William Shakespeare trying to, the Spanish Armada had been a success and Drake had failed. And so England was under Spain's boot. And I knew the history and really enjoyed the novel. And I suspect, Richie, you're right, that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know that, because I'm already feeling a sense of hopelessness about where education is headed. So I get that. I definitely get that. Okay.
Yes.
Pamela. Okay. That was, how do you find the books you consider reviewing? And that's a good question.
They come to us from a couple of places. Sometimes our editor at the paper will flag something and ask us to give it a look. But we also comb the publishing houses' catalogs.
Okay.
We tend to do that as far in, sort of, they give us like 6 months lead time. Sometimes they put out a catalog a year in advance of titles, and we just start plotting them into our spreadsheet.
Okay.
But most of them come from the PR contact at the publishing house. That's how most of them get to us. And Brian, more than I do, kind of plugs into the network of what I'll let you say it, like, what writers are saying about other writers, if I'm phrasing that right.
Yeah, and so the other things, I'll get to that part in a sec. We use NetGalley. We do have to, and this is kind of a footnote to the thing about omission. We're limited to books that are in physical print and available directly in the Irish and UK market, not stuff that's only available as an import. So there is some material that we, like Adrian McKinty has 1 or 2 books that are only available in the States at the time that we've got to wait until knock on wood, an Irish UK edition comes out to be able to take a look at those. And we also try to limit to stuff that is coming out within, for writing a September column that's coming out maybe end of August to beginning of October. We don't want to publish something a month before the book is out, which isn't going to be a huge help to that book.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also NetGalley UK, which was kind of difficult to arrange with US IP addresses, but eventually we got that sorted. So I combed through everything that's listed for our target month on NetGalley UK. And a lot of it, if it's an ebook, we've got to kind of set it aside. And, and out of that, we'll develop a short list and try and keep track of the stuff that we ruled out preemptively, so we know it at least came to mind. The PR people will sometimes send us stuff. What's a little more common is honestly that we find something on NetGalley or in the catalog and we go to them to ask for it. Or there have been a number of things like Mayfield Smoke Kings comes to mind, which we reviewed back in January. Just see if there's something else recent like that. Atticalock's Got Me Home. Stuart Neville's Blood Like Mine. There were a string of 3 or 4 that we heard about because I saw other writers posting about them on social media. And not that we're taking their word for it, although the writers in question, I've had good experience with their taste over time. But that kind of signaled something to us to go ask our PR contact at the publisher for that title. And so that's brought a couple of good things to our line of sight that maybe we just missed for one reason or another otherwise.
Okay. All right. Richie has another question that actually is worth.
Can we
go ahead?
There was one the MWA New York account had posted a question earlier about
yes,
something that stand out as positive or that turn you off. I just want to, maybe if you want us to answer Richie's first, but I just want to.
No, I actually go back.
Flag that one.
Because I'm
Okay.
trying to scroll through and I'm following and so
It
forth.
keeps bouncing up. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and the blocks keep changing location, so I'm looking one way or the other.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead and answer the MWA question first. I think it was Nev. Would have done that.
For my part, and again, this is where it being a collaborative column is a little interesting because I might have a higher tolerance for, say, violence than Beth does, and Beth might have a higher tolerance for sort of locked room mysteries than I would. That doesn't mean that a book can't clear that bar with either of us, and we've sort of learned to handle that by if it's something that's seeming a little violent for her, I'll take a look at it first. Or if it's a writer I know personally, she'll take a look at it first. And so we kind of read with each other as a prospective audience in mind to some extent. I'll say one thing that is almost nothing rules anything out. One thing that's a real high bar to clear with me is a psychologist, therapist, profiler based mystery, partly because my wife is a therapist. And so I have a very acute sense of what the actual professional code of ethics looks like. Like, no, it's not okay to sleep with your patient, for example. No, that's not what Freud said, or whatever it is. And so I've got, it's easy for me to get impatient with those kinds of things. And similar, some stuff, as a former academic, some stuff set on a university campus, it's just too easy to be like, that's not how it works. And so that's not really an assessment of worth or merit. That's where, we're readers, and that's where the idiosyncrasies of taste come in. But that's another reason why, again, I wouldn't want to review a book I'm very personally intemperate about along those lines, because on some level, that's just a matter of not every reader is married to a therapist, So that's one for me. Books have a lot of sex that try too hard to be funny, that are based around music, are just ones that I find very easy to kind of get one wrong note that sets the whole thing off. But then again, there's always an exception. I picked up Daniel Weitzman's Cinnamon Girl, which we reviewed in the May column, thinking I'm going to roll this out in 20 or 30 pages just because the music thing is so hard to get right for me. And it was a very sweet book. We both really, really enjoyed it. So even for something that sets us off or sets off an alarm bell, insofar as time allows and the limits of, how much time we can afford to put into the column allows, we still are very kind of conscientious about giving something a chance.
Sure.
We like being wrong.
And that's okay, because sometimes you're mistaken and you're happily mistaken, and that's okay. And
Exactly.
The collaboration
Exactly.
works well in terms of shared and alternating responsibilities. That becomes a model for collaboration. I'm not a collaborator. I mean, when I write alone. But I also write plays, and sometimes, when we're doing a table read, and I'll listen to the actors and so forth, and they'll have input, and we make changes and so forth. And that sort of satisfies my collaboration thing. But the other process, I'm sitting right here, zoning out on the rest of the world while I'm doing that. So you guys have a good collaborative relationship, which is outstanding. Richard,
but did you want to add anything to that, Beth, about the
I was going to add
immediate likes, dislikes?
Well, it's a pet peeve, actually, more than a like or dislike. Cliche dialogue drives me bananas. When an author is perhaps paying an homage to noir or something else, and they feel a need to, it's a fine line between an homage and a bad imitation. And when that line gets crossed into bad imitation, I'm not likely to continue reading it much past 30, 40 pages, maybe 50 if I'm very patient. And I don't know how that happens. The cliche dialogue, like when it does happen, when I come across it, I'm usually surprised, even though it happens somewhat regularly, because I don't understand how it gets past the editor. And so sometimes, a pet peeve is when there's a bit of tone deafness. And I also see the note about social justice issues that Richie put in the chat. I did see a rise in that immediately following Me Too. But, you know, it was interesting because it was a peak. But now I don't even notice it as a trend anymore. I consider it part of living. And since so much of the books in our category, you know, are set in realism, it's no different being in there than a crime occurring being in there. You know.
Right. It's just a different kind of crime.
Yeah. Do you try to review books that tie into current events? We don't go out of our way to do that. You know, as Brian has indicated, we take everything on its face. But if it's a trend, yeah, I would say it's kind of standard issue now. And to Brian's point, just, you know, another way of conveying or you know, building into the narrative of the crime, but the crime is still central. But no, I don't go out of my way, if that's what you mean, Rich. I don't go out of my way to sort of identify books that fit into that category.
Okay.
And I mean, I'll say too that there's some we review. I mean, Cahokia Jazz, obviously, but also, you know, like Thomas Mullen's Rumor Gang out earlier this year, we reviewed, and that was a historical mystery, but it was a historical mystery that it felt maybe not uncoincidental, but distinctly apt, that it was in a lot of ways about kind of grappling with particularly American varieties of nativism, of fascism, and of incipient fascism. And so it was not about our present moment, but it kind of also wasn't not about it, if that makes sense. And those are a very, very good book. And, you know, so when we reviewed something like Mayfield's Smoke Kings, it was also a debut novel, and there was a lot of slightly rough energy to that as a debut, to my mind, and it had an interesting setup. I think we both thought, and kind of an interesting kind of idea for the plot, and it ran with that. But the reason we include it was not because of what it was about, but because how it was about what it was about. If that makes sense.
Okay. No,
you know, I mean, that was my feeling about it. Sorry, that sounds like I'm speaking for Beth more than I mean to.
well, do you want to add?
Synchronicity.
Okay. Again, underscoring the collaboration.
Yeah.
One thing I think that bugs the hell out of me in historical fiction in general are sad anachronisms. You know, I read a mystery set in the 19th century, and then someone tosses out the term serial killer, and I want to smack my head against the wall, because where we are is not the only point in time, but for some people, it seems to be the only point in time. And so I get those kinds of things, and they do bug me. I don't want to name names or anything like that, but it was nobody here, by the way. But it's just, you see some things like that and you think, as Beth said, how did it get past the editor? How did the obvious Humphrey Bogart impression in dialogue get past the editor? I can see an homage to Dashiell Hammett, but I can't see a downright ripoff that uses the same tones and the same dialogue and the same rhythms without a measure of originality. So, well, what's We talked about trends. What's on the horizon for each one of you? Beth, why don't you go first? What's up for you these days? Where are you headed with your career, both as a critic and a writer?
Well, I just got an email this morning from the publisher with the cover and an announcement that the new book's going to be in their warehouse on the 17th. So
that's the book on Chip Delaney.
Yeah, it's on the great Chip Delaney, Samuel R. Delaney, the Afrofuturist, Hall of Fame fantasy and sci-fi writer and amazing literary theorist and cultural critic. It's a labor of love. It's total departure. I usually write about either crime fiction or theater. But I had the good fortune of teaching Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses, with him for a while. And he's been a big part of my life. And there's a Beckett, the Grove Companion to Beckett. Every time I looked at it, I'm like, there needs to be a Grove Companion to Delaney. And it finally came together with the help of 3 collaborators. So that'll be out soon. And I finished a book on Wallace Shawn, so going back to theater, his plays, not his acting career. And that is pretty much done. But the problem has been, I started it quite a long time ago, and then American politics and Brexit made me reevaluate how I was going to present the material. And now for the last week, I've realized, oh, well, I think I have to make another adjustment to the material because he's a very, he was writing about authoritarian democracies 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to be finishing, making those revisions, and a chapter that one of my readers said, I don't know why it's here. I think that one must need some work too. And that'll be done in January.
Okay. Hey, Brian, what about you?
I am kind of blissfully free of long-term, large-scale projects right now. And I am not finding myself super driven to change that basic fact. I think I'm doing this. I'm doing some other freelance work I can't really talk about yet. But in terms of, like, in the wake of the election, for example, one of the things I do here in Berkeley is I volunteer at and DJ at KALX, which is the UC Berkeley radio station. It's been around for about 60 years and actually has a reasonably respectable FM range throughout the Bay Area. And just kind of going back and reinvesting a little bit more time in that particular local community as a creative outlet. I mean, I'm not the hardest class I took in undergrad was a creative writing tutorial I had to take for the major. And I've not had any desire to repeat the experience. Teacher was great, I wasn't. And so this is much more my lane. But there was that question earlier about, does what you learn from critiquing impact your own writing? I don't write fiction or poetry or drama. I think what it has done for me in terms of my own nonfiction prose is having the discipline of having to hit 1,200 words, not 1195 and not 1205, but having to hit 1,200 and tick a couple of very specific boxes about what we want to say, have it still sound like some combination of us. And, since these are all books we believe in on some level, kind of making a pitch to readers for why maybe the readers should be interested in them too, in a very tight space, has kind of so reaffirmed my faith, which maybe dissipated a little bit in the academy, in being as concise as I can. And being to the point in that regard. But so it's continuing to kind of get better at this, I would hope, and reinvesting a little bit locally in terms of the radio station and that kind of working with music.
Okay.
I do write fiction, but under a pen name. And to answer the question about how this has changed that, pretty significantly. I'm going to go back to fiction once I'm done with Delaney and then Sean. And I'm certain that it's going to make the next one significantly better than the other two were.
Okay. All right. Well, I thank you both for being here tonight,
My pleasure. Thanks for having
Thanks
us.
for having us.
sharing your expertise and your ideas, and answering our questions. And are there any questions as we're rolling out? Because I do have a couple comments